The woman stood still in the bustling lobby of the high-security military facility. Her hands relaxed at her sides. Her appearance was unassuming, just a white t-shirt, a windbreaker that had seen better days, and a pair of worn jeans that seemed out of place amidst the crisp uniforms and polished boots of the soldiers around her. No one would have looked twice at her. She was the kind of person you might see in any grocery store or cafe, someone who blended effortlessly into the background. Yet, in this setting, she was anything but ordinary. The guards at the security checkpoint barely spared her a glance as she approached, too busy with the task at hand to notice anything unusual about the woman standing before them. One of them gestured toward her with a bored look on his face, as if it was just another routine check. She was asked to present her ID, and the woman reached into her jacket pocket without a word. The ID she held out was nothing extraordinary at first glance, no special markings, no elaborate design to set it apart. But as she handed it over, something in the air seemed to shift, if only slightly, a subtle tension weaving into the otherwise mundane process. The officers behind the counter eyed her, the young officer taking her ID with the familiar sense of superiority that came with his position. He smirked, as if she were just another unremarkable civilian in the line of people who had no idea what they were dealing with. He scanned the ID without much thought, turning it between his fingers as though it were just another piece of plastic. The other officers, standing behind him, exchanged bored glances, their attention clearly not on the woman but on the tedium of their routine. Despite this, the woman remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch under their scrutiny, nor did she feel the need to explain herself. She simply stood there, waiting silent, patient, and unwavering. There was no discomfort in her posture, no sign of impatience or agitation. To anyone observing, she appeared as though she had all the time in the world, her gaze calm, unhurried, as though the world had slowed down around her. The contrast between her calm demeanor and the strict, tense atmosphere of the military facility was almost unsettling. The officer raised an eyebrow as he glanced down at the ID again, his smirk lingering. He was just about to hand it back, sure that the scan would show it was invalid or forged, when she said in a calm, measured tone, "Scan it again." Her voice was soft yet unyielding. It was a statement, not a request. The officer hesitated. But there was something in the way she spoke that made him pause for a moment, longer than he normally would have. He rolled his eyes, his jaw tightening slightly, but did as she asked, now more out of mild amusement than any real expectation of a result. The scanner beeped once, twice, and then the unexpected happened. The screen flickered, lines of encrypted code running across the display, far beyond the simple rejection he had anticipated. The young officer's smirk faltered, and the other guards shifted uncomfortably as the entire system seemed to glitch for a moment. The sudden change was subtle but palpable, the atmosphere in the room changing from casual indifference to a quiet unease. The woman remained unfazed by the technological glitch, her demeanor still composed. She didn't rush to explain herself, didn't offer an explanation for what was happening. She simply waited. As the system struggled, something within the facility began to respond to her presence. The cold, rigid walls of the military security system, designed to detect even the smallest irregularity, seemed to bend to her will, as though it recognized her as something more than just a visitor. In that moment, no one spoke. The officers looked around, their confidence slipping away as the reality of the situation began to set in. There was nothing overt or dramatic in the woman's actions, nothing loud or forceful. It was all done quietly, effortlessly, as though it were a natural extension of her being. She did not need to say anything more, for her very presence in the room was enough to make the world stop for a brief, heart-stopping moment. The scene around her, everything from the soldiers' unease to the stillness of the room, should spark curiosity in the viewer. They should be left wondering who this woman is and why she is so unflinching. In this high-stakes environment, there's no rush, no dramatic revelation, just the quiet power that emanates from her as the story begins to unfold. Through this interaction, a sense of wonder should be built, with the main character's calm authority slowly taking center stage, compelling the audience to question what lies beneath her unassuming exterior. The young officer held the ID between two fingers, his smirk widening as he looked down at it. He flicked his eyes to the woman standing in front of him, and then back to the card, clearly unimpressed. "This is either fake," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "or you're a very confused librarian trying to get into a military base. Are you sure you're in the right place?" His words were casual, dismissive, as if he had seen this 1,000 times before, people trying to sneak into places they didn't belong. He didn't believe for a second that the woman could have any legitimate reason to be here. He glanced over to his colleagues, barely containing his amusement, and the other guards chuckled under their breath. The officer handed the ID to one of the other guards, his tone laced with condescension as he added, "What is this? Some kind of spy movie?" The second guard took the card, his eyes rolling as he scanned it, barely looking at the woman who stood still, her expression unmoving. They could see she was no threat. Her worn jeans and simple t-shirt made her seem out of place in the sterile, high-security setting. What could she possibly be doing here? They thought, clearly above suspicion. They were already certain her ID would be rejected. It was just a matter of waiting for the system to confirm what they already knew. She was an imposter, out of her depth. She didn't respond. She simply stood there, watching them with quiet patience, her eyes not revealing even the slightest hint of frustration or anger. It was as though she didn't care that they were mocking her, didn't feel the need to explain herself. She made no attempt to defend the validity of her ID. Instead, she just waited, her silence holding more power than any words could convey. The guards, meanwhile, continued to poke fun at her. One of them muttered under his breath, "What's next? You need a clearance level to order lunch here." They laughed, completely unaware of how much they were underestimating her. The first officer was already moving to dismiss her, certain the ID scan would validate his assumptions. He wasn't even interested in what she had to say, already writing her off as an intruder. As he pressed the button to activate the scanner, he shot her one last look of derision. She didn't flinch. The scanner beeped once, then twice. The officer grinned to himself, about to confirm what he already knew, that this woman was exactly what he thought she was, just another person who didn't belong. But then, the beep faltered, and the screen froze. The guards' laughter died abruptly as they saw the system hiccup, the display glitching and filling with strange lines of encrypted code. The officer blinked, his smirk faltering. He hadn't expected this. He stared at the screen, his brow furrowing in confusion. The second officer, still holding the ID, exchanged a glance with him. This wasn't right. The system didn't just freeze. They were trained for this: protocols, checks, security systems that never failed. But this was different. The ID that they had mocked was now showing something that didn't fit, something they couldn't explain. And yet, the woman stood there, silent, unbothered by their confusion. "What the hell?" one of the other guards muttered, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. It wasn't a question anymore, it was disbelief. The young officer fumbled with the scanner, his fingers brushing over the keys in a desperate attempt to correct the malfunction. The system refused to respond. He cleared his throat, but the tension in the room was palpable now. The woman had yet to speak, her calm presence almost eerie in the face of their growing panic. The laughter was gone now, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. The officer finally looked up at the woman, still standing completely still, her gaze unwavering. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick with the growing realization that something wasn't right. He didn't know who she was, but he was starting to feel that he should have taken her more seriously. The second guard, still standing beside the first, cleared his throat awkwardly and shifted his weight. The woman remained motionless, her eyes unblinking, as if the chaos around her was irrelevant. She hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of the unease the guards were now feeling. In fact, her stillness only seemed to make the situation more unnerving. She was perfectly composed, as though everything was exactly as it should be, while the officers, caught up in their own ignorance, were becoming increasingly flustered. Their dismissive attitude was turning to something else now. The air had shifted, subtly, but with undeniable weight. The arrogance with which they had first treated her was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The young officer shot one last glance at the woman. He wasn't sure what to do now. All he knew was that this wasn't supposed to happen. His initial sense of superiority had crumbled in the face of something far bigger than he could comprehend. As they continued to wrestle with the malfunctioning system, the woman still said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence, calm and collected, was doing all the talking. The guards, once so certain of their place in the hierarchy, were now at a loss. They couldn't explain what was happening, and they certainly couldn't explain her. They had no idea what was coming next. This moment was the calm before the storm, a brief lull in the action before everything would change. The tension in the room was now palpable, thick enough to feel, and yet there was no panic from the woman. She remained unflappable, her role, whatever it truly was, looming larger by the second. The officer's fingers moved quickly over the scanner's controls, the smirk still playing at the corners of his lips. He was convinced that the woman's ID was a fake, that it would be rejected instantly. He inserted it with the same casual indifference, prepared to return it to her with a few more mocking comments. But then, something strange happened. The scanner emitted a soft beep, but instead of the usual rejection tone, the screen flickered, then froze entirely. The steady hum of the facility's computer suddenly fell silent, a jarring interruption that made the room feel colder, more tense. The young officer's fingers hovered over the keys as the system remained unresponsive, his smile faltering as his eyes darted between the machine and the woman standing before him. For a moment, the silence was thick, oppressive. The other guards exchanged confused glances, the atmosphere shifting from casual mockery to palpable unease. One of them leaned in, trying to make sense of the malfunction, but the system refused to cooperate. The monitors, once displaying routine security information, now filled with a stream of encrypted code. It was a cascade of numbers and symbols, too complex for any of them to understand. The young officer's breath hitched as he stared at the display, his overconfidence evaporating in the face of something he couldn't control. The smug look on his face faded entirely, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The code seemed endless, shifting in a language none of them could read. The other guards, sensing the gravity of the situation, began to lose their composure. The room, once filled with quiet laughter, now hummed with tension. One of the older guards turned to the officer, his face a mix of confusion and concern. What the hell's going on?" he asked, his voice low, but the fear was there. The officer didn't respond immediately. His hand hovered over the console, unsure of what to do next. His entire confidence had vanished, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could control the situation. Meanwhile, the woman stood completely still, her calm presence almost unsettling against the rising chaos. Her gaze remained steady, not a flicker of concern on her face. She seemed almost detached from the panic around her, her posture as composed as ever. The guards, in their panic, couldn't understand it. She was standing there, watching them, not moving, as if this was just another day. The dissonance between her tranquility and the escalating confusion in the room grew, making her presence feel even more imposing. The officer's voice cracked when he spoke again, trying to regain control of the situation. This can't be right," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. His fingers fumbled with the scanner, but nothing worked. The machine continued to flicker and flash, its data running across the screen in an incomprehensible jumble. The guards exchanged worried glances, realizing that whatever was happening wasn't normal. The ID that they had ridiculed was now the center of a problem they didn't know how to fix. As the seconds ticked by, the room grew heavier with tension. The woman's calmness only made the chaos feel more intense. She wasn't even glancing at the screen, her attention still directed ahead, unfazed by the digital storm unfolding before them. The officers, however, were growing increasingly frantic. One guard stepped forward, his voice rising in a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You better explain what's going on," he said, his tone losing its earlier arrogance, but the woman remained silent, her presence alone sending a clear message. She was not the one who needed to explain. The officer who had initially scanned the ID was now visibly sweating, his palms clammy as he continued to tap at the scanner. Growing more desperate with each passing second, the system refused to yield. Finally, the entire screen blinked black before flashing to a deep blue, displaying an emblem that no one in the room recognized. It was glowing, faintly golden, almost otherworldly. For a moment, no one moved. The emblem lingered on the screen, its significance obvious but inexplicable. This wasn't a routine failure. This was something much deeper. One of the younger guards stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. "Is that classified?" he asked, his words thick with uncertainty. The officer didn't respond, his face pale as he stared at the emblem, his mind racing to understand what was happening. There was no answer, only the sound of a single, soft beep as the scanner reset itself. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. What had once been an almost routine interaction was now a high-stakes puzzle. With no clear solution, the woman stood motionless, an enigma, while the guards grappled with the impossible. Her lack of response was deafening in the midst of their confusion. It was as though she had no need to explain herself, no need to defend the legitimacy of her ID. She had done nothing but present it, and now, the entire facility was in turmoil. Her calm presence felt like a quiet command, a reminder that she held power far beyond what any of the guards could comprehend. The shift in the room was undeniable. What had started as mockery was now a tense silence, and the woman remained at the center, untouchable, unshaken. The tone of the room continued to change. The guards, once laughing at her, were now standing frozen, their mockery replaced by fear and confusion. The young officer's earlier arrogance was completely gone. replaced by an edge of panic as the screen displayed the unfamiliar emblem. The woman, however, remained the same, composed, unmoving, as if she knew exactly what was happening, even if no one else did. Her stillness was more powerful than any words could be, and the officers, now aware that they had underestimated her, could only watch in awe as the situation spiraled beyond their control. As the confusion in the room reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The door behind the woman opened with no warning, and two men appeared, stepping into the lobby as if they belonged there, though they had bypassed every security check. They didn't enter through the main door, nor did they pass through the checkpoints like everyone else. They simply emerged, appearing as if they had been waiting in the shadows. The guards, still grappling with the malfunctioning system, turned as one of the men moved into view. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, an unspoken recognition hanging in the air. The two men moved with purpose, their gait steady and deliberate. They were both dressed in dark suits, sharply cut, their presence commanding without needing a word. Their eyes locked on the woman, and the tension in the room seemed to fade for a moment as they approached her. Without a hint of hesitation, they nodded respectfully. Their gaze never wavered from her face, and it was clear that they weren't just acknowledging her. They were deferring to her. One of the men, taller and older, gave a subtle but noticeable tilt of the head, a gesture that spoke volumes more than mere formality. There was no need for words between them. Their respect was absolute, immediate, and unquestionable. The guards, who had been mocking the woman only moments before, now stood frozen, their faces pale as they watched this exchange. The initial disbelief on their faces was quickly replaced by a dawning realization. These men were not like the others. They were not ordinary officers or security personnel. The way they stood in the woman's presence, the way they moved toward her, without any sign of surprise or questioning, made it abundantly clear that she was not someone to be taken lightly. The guards, who had once felt invincible in their own world of security and control, now looked vulnerable. Their confusion deepened with each passing second. The taller man, who appeared to be the senior of the two, spoke softly, but his voice carried across the room with quiet authority. "Agent Monroe, we've been expecting you," he said. The words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, settling over the entire room. The mention of her name seemed to flip a switch in the guards' minds. What had once been a mocking encounter suddenly felt like a breach of protocol. The man who had mocked the woman just moments earlier took a small, almost imperceptible step back, his gaze still locked on the woman, now realizing that everything he thought he knew about this situation was wrong. Monroe's expression never changed. She did not respond to the men directly, but the slightest shift in her posture, her subtle acknowledgement of their arrival was enough. She remained calm, her composure unbroken, and the guards could feel the weight of her silence, which seemed to carry more power than any command could. The two men, who had shown immediate respect, now stood a mere few feet behind her, their presence adding a layer of gravitas to the already charged atmosphere. The woman wasn't just part of this world, they were clearly part of hers. This was no ordinary exchange. The guards shifted uneasily, their nervous glances now directed at the two agents. They had no idea who these men were, but the way they behaved around the woman told them everything they needed to. No, she wasn't just another visitor to the facility. The two agents' respect for her was unmistakable, and it only deepened the guards' confusion. The sudden appearance of the men didn't just shift the dynamic, it completely redefined it. Where once there was arrogance, there was now hesitation. Where there had been mockery, now there was the quiet realization that they had underestimated the woman standing before them. As the silence stretched on, the younger officer tried to regain his composure, but his voice shook when he finally spoke. Is she with you?" he asked, his words faltering. His question was not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need for validation. The senior agent gave a brief nod, his eyes never leaving the woman, his respect for her unquestionable. "She is," he confirmed, his voice steady, his tone cutting through the uncertainty that had gripped the room. The woman, still unmoved, seemed to absorb the moment, her silence wrapping around her like a shield. The agents had just confirmed her status, but she didn't need their validation. Her authority was already palpable in the air. The change in the room was immediate and undeniable. The guards, who had initially laughed at her, were now the ones standing in awe. Their world had been turned upside down. The calm, composed woman who had seemed like an easy target was now the epicenter of an unspoken power. The agents, with their presence and unquestioning respect, had only amplified that power. The guards who had been so sure of their position were now left feeling small. their mockery of the woman nothing more than a painful reminder of their ignorance. The senior agent turned to one of the other guards, his voice still steady, but now carrying an edge of authority that had been entirely absent before. "You may want to reconsider your approach," he said, his words carrying the weight of experience and understanding. The guard swallowed hard, his face flushed with embarrassment. The shift in the room was palpable. The sense of superiority that had once characterized the guards had dissipated, replaced by something more akin to fear. Fear not of the woman herself, but of the world she represented, a world they could never truly understand. And through it all, the woman remained calm, her quiet authority undisturbed. She didn't need to explain herself, didn't need to raise her voice. Her power, as it had been before, was silent, steady, and unwavering. The respect that the two men showed her only reinforced her dominance, casting a shadow over the once confident guards who had been quick to dismiss her. The tension in the room continued to grow, not from fear of the woman herself, but from the understanding that she was not someone to be trifled with. The guards now felt as though they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than themselves, and they had no idea how deep it ran. In that moment, the woman was no longer just a person in a white t-shirt and worn jeans. She was the center of an unseen, undeniable power, one that even the most seasoned of officers recognized and respected. The agent's presence confirmed that whatever she was, wherever she came from, she was someone to be feared, even if no one truly understood why. The woman walked forward, and the moment she took her first step into the facility, something changed. It wasn't immediately obvious, but to anyone paying attention, it was undeniable. The heavy steel doors ahead of her, once locked and sealed tight, slid open with a smoothness that made no sense. No code, no swipe of a badge. They just opened. It was as if the walls of the facility themselves recognized her and responded to her presence, acknowledging her before she even moved. The hallway she entered was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As she moved, however, the lights flickered briefly before adjusting, following her every step. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, just a slight shift in brightness. But anyone who had spent enough time in this place would notice it. The room seemed to breathe with her, shifting as she did. The temperature, too, adjusted, cooling the air just slightly, as though the system was trying to accommodate her, to make her feel at ease in a space built to reject any intrusion. Her every movement was mirrored by the space around her, bending, responding as though the very architecture of the facility were attuned to her presence. As she walked deeper into the complex, the security cameras that lined the walls stopped moving. They stopped tracking her, freezing in place as if they had no need to monitor her. The monitors in the surveillance room, previously filled with the usual feeds of guards and personnel, now displayed static nothing but a blank screen where once there had been footage of the building's interior. The analysts watching the footage, who had been closely monitoring the situation, found themselves suddenly staring at empty screens, their fingers hovering over keyboards in confusion. No one said anything for a moment. It was as if the facility itself had gone silent, its very systems refusing to process her. The stillness was unnerving, like a suspended moment in time. The woman, in contrast, seemed completely undisturbed. She did not hurry, did not look over her shoulder. Her steps were deliberate, calm, almost as though she were walking through a familiar space, not the high-security facility that had previously been so stringent about access. She moved as if everything in this place was meant to accommodate her. It was eerie, like watching someone navigate a world where they were the only one who truly belonged. Inside the surveillance room, the analysts, though accustomed to technical malfunctions, exchanged nervous glances. Something was off. They had never seen a complete shutdown of their system like this, especially not without any external cause. The lead analyst, an older man with a deep understanding of the facility's operations, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What's happening?" he muttered, but no one had an answer. The screens remained black, and the rest of the facility operated in its own quiet, strange rhythm as though attuned to her every movement. In the hallway, the woman reached a security checkpoint and the access panel, usually a complex interaction of touchscreens and coded inputs, blinked to life the moment she approached. The door slid open without the need for her to touch a single control. No guards, no scans, no verification, just the silent acknowledgement of her presence. She passed through, and the door closed behind her without a sound. To anyone still watching, the scene might have seemed like a malfunction, but it was clear now that it was no glitch. The system, as intricate and carefully designed as it was bending to her will. As she walked deeper into the heart of the facility, The analysts in the surveillance room could feel the weight of the moment. They had been trained to detect every abnormality, every piece of data that didn't fit. But this was different. There was nothing in their training that prepared them for what was unfolding. The systems weren't malfunctioning. They were simply not functioning at all, at least. Not the way they were designed to. They were bending, shifting in response to the woman's presence. And the room grew colder as the realization set in. She was in control, not just of herself, but of everything around her. The woman continued on her path, unaffected by the strange events unfolding. Her calmness was almost unsettling, as if the environment around her, the security systems, the very walls of the facility, were designed to respond to her and her alone. She didn't need to give orders, didn't need to use force. The facility, once a fortress of technology and surveillance, was simply following her lead. It was an unsettling power, the kind that didn't need to be flaunted. The woman didn't need to prove anything. Everything around her spoke for her. The lead analyst's voice finally broke the silence, shaking as he spoke into the intercom. Shut down the systems. Do a manual reset. Everything. Now. But there was a sense of finality in his voice, as if he knew it wouldn't matter. No one could override what was happening. Not with the flick of a switch or a few keystrokes. The woman, with nothing more than her presence, had already won. Her authority, absolute and unquestioned, was flowing through the very systems that had once seemed so indomitable. As she reached the center of the facility, the last layer of security systems fell into place without her lifting a finger. The air felt thick with tension, but the woman remained untouched by it. Her power was not about force, but about quiet dominance, about being the key to a system that responded to her alone. She was the heartbeat of this place now, and everything around her recognized that fact without question, without challenge. The analysts could only watch in stunned silence as she moved deeper into the heart of the facility, her every step reshaping the reality of their operations. The woman had not spoken, had not demanded anything, yet she controlled it all. The entire facility had bowed to her, and it was impossible to ignore the full extent of her influence. In that moment, the audience should feel the overwhelming, surreal force of her presence, the quiet, unstoppable wave of authority that surrounded her. The facility, the people within it, everything was subject to her will, and it was a power that was as unsettling as it was awe-inspiring. The atmosphere in the facility was now thick with tension, and the weight of the earlier moments hung heavily in the air. The guards, who had once mocked the woman's appearance and questioned her identity, now stood frozen, their faces pale as they tried to make sense of the events unfolding before them. They had been so certain, so sure of their own superiority, that they never considered the possibility that they had misjudged her. The scanners had failed. The doors had opened for her without a touch. And now, as the systems refused to function as they were designed, the guards felt a creeping realization that something was fundamentally different about this woman. She wasn't just a visitor. She wasn't even a guest. She was something else entirely. The young officer, who had laughed at her only minutes ago, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His gaze flickered between the woman's calm, composed figure and the now empty screens where surveillance footage should have been. His confidence had dissolved, replaced by an unsettling uncertainty. He tried to make sense of what he had seen, but his mind couldn't catch up to the reality of the situation. In his mind, he had expected to dismiss her with a few words, to laugh at her foolishness, but now there was no laughter, only the sting of his own arrogance. He had been wrong, spectacularly wrong. The woman had never been a threat to the security of the facility. She was the threat itself, but not in the way he had imagined. Beside him, one of the older guards stood with his arms crossed, eyes downcast, as if lost in thought. His earlier mockery had vanished, replaced by something else, regret, perhaps, or a deep sense of shame. He had assumed that the woman was nothing more than a naive outsider, someone who had wandered into a place where she didn't belong. But now, seeing the way the system had bent around her, he understood that his assumption had been as foolish as the others. There was no denying it. He had mocked someone far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. The thought made him uneasy, the weight of his earlier arrogance settling in his chest. He could feel his earlier behavior, the dismissiveness, like a stain he couldn't erase. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a humbling recognition of how little he truly understood about the world around him. As the senior guard turned to the younger officer, there was a subtle shift in his expression, the lines of arrogance gone from his face. He didn't speak at first, but his eyes followed the woman's calm progress through the facility, her every move seeming to command respect from the very walls themselves. He realized the full extent of his misjudgment. The woman wasn't just walking through the building, she was rewriting the rules of what was possible here. The idea that someone like her could slip through the cracks, unnoticed, was laughable. The realization was staggering, and for a brief moment, the guard felt small, insignificant in the face of a power he couldn't fathom. In the surveillance room, the analysts, too, began to feel the shift. What had started as a minor malfunction was now a mystery, one that went beyond their understanding of the systems they had worked with. For years, they had always prided themselves on their ability to control the flow of information, to monitor every inch of the facility, to catch even the smallest irregularity. But now, as they watched the footage of the woman's movements freeze and the system fail to capture any of her actions, they knew they were out of their depth. They had been trained to handle all manner of security breaches. But this wasn't a breach, it was something far more profound. The woman wasn't just a part of the system, she was above it. And as they stared at the blank screens, one of the analysts couldn't help but wonder if they had just been witnesses to something that no one had ever seen before. He felt a strange mixture of awe and fear, the realization hitting him that the woman was not just someone important. She was the very heartbeat of the system they had spent years perfecting. The younger officer, still standing at the security checkpoint, glanced over at the senior guard, who was now deep in thought. There was no mockery in the older man's eyes, no sense of superiority. The younger officer swallowed hard, a wave of self-doubt sweeping over him. He had been quick to judge, to belittle the woman because of her appearance and demeanor. But now, he understood the gravity of his mistake. The quiet strength that had radiated from her had been more than just a personality trait. It had been the key to everything that had happened. His stomach turned as he thought about his earlier words. The way he had dismissed her. The way he had laughed. He couldn't take any of it back. The shame settled over him, heavier than any reprimand could have been. As the woman continued her journey through the facility, each step seemed to shake the very foundation of the world the guards had built for themselves. They had once felt invincible in their authority, their uniforms, their control over the system. But now, they were left standing in the wake of their own arrogance, realizing that their assumptions had been completely wrong. The woman wasn't someone to be mocked. She was someone to be respected, feared, and perhaps even revered. The power she held was not obvious at first glance. It was quiet, subtle, and so overwhelming that it had slipped right past their understanding until now. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as the woman disappeared. Further into the facility, the older guard let out a long, slow breath, the weight of the realization still pressing down on him. He had misjudged her, and in doing so, he had insulted someone far beyond his understanding. The silent regret was almost suffocating. It was a feeling the other guards were beginning to share, their earlier arrogance now replaced by a deep, humbling awareness of their own limitations. The atmosphere had changed, irrevocably. They no longer saw the woman as an outsider or an intruder. They saw her for what she truly was, someone in control, someone whose presence was both commanding and unshakable. The shift in perception was complete. The audience, both within the story and watching it unfold, should feel the weight of this transformation, the moment when the guards finally understood just how wrong they had been. The realization settled in, slow but unmistakable. They had mocked her, underestimated her, and now they could only watch in awe as she moved through their world with an ease and authority they would never have predicted. The humbling truth was undeniable. She was not just a part of their world. She was the force that shaped it. The woman's footsteps echoed softly down the corridor as she moved deeper, into the heart of the facility. By now, she had passed through every obstacle, every layer of security that had once been impenetrable. Yet, she hadn't said a word. There were no grand gestures, no forceful commands. She had simply moved through the space, as if it were her own, and everything around her had responded in kind. The guards, the analysts, the facility itself, everything had bent to her presence. And still, the woman remained the same, quiet, calm, detached. It was a lesson they would not soon forget, one that had unfolded without a single spoken word. The younger officer, who had once laughed at her, stood still, his gaze fixed on the now empty hallway. He didn't know what to think anymore. His earlier mockery seemed foolish, childish even, and the weight of that realization was heavy in his chest. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as nothing more than an ordinary person, a woman who didn't belong in a place like this. But now, he understood just how wrong he had been. The woman was a force, not because of her appearance or her words, but because of something far deeper, something that didn't need to be shouted or demanded. Her power was quiet, subtle, and undeniable. In the surveillance room, the analysts had stopped watching the blank screens. Their work, their precision, their control, everything they had believed in, had been disrupted by something they couldn't comprehend. They had spent their careers managing systems, monitoring every detail, keeping everything in order, but they hadn't expected this. They hadn't anticipated the sheer quiet authority of someone who didn't need to adhere to the rules they had spent years perfecting. The woman had shown them that power wasn't always about control or technology. Sometimes it was about the calm presence that commanded the room without uttering a single word. The senior guard, who had once been the most dismissive, now stood in quiet reflection. His eyes followed the woman as she disappeared into the depths of the facility, his mind replaying the moment he had laughed at her, the moment he had misjudged her. His thoughts felt almost like an apology, though he had never spoken one. He had assumed that power came from badges, ranks, and technology. But now, he saw that it could come from a place much deeper, a place that didn't need the trappings of authority to make itself known. The realization stung, but it was a necessary one. He could feel the humbling shift within himself as he recognized the true nature of the woman he had mocked. As the woman's figure faded from view, the facility seemed to return to its normal rhythm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for those who had witnessed her presence, nothing would ever be the same again. The guards who had once felt invincible now understood the fragility of their own assumptions. The analysts who had watched from their screens now felt the weight of the lesson that had unfolded before them. Power, they realized, wasn't always where you expected it to be. It wasn't in the uniforms or the technology. It wasn't in the flashing lights or the reinforced doors. It was in the quiet strength of someone who didn't need to prove anything. The woman, without lifting a finger, had shown them that appearances could be deceiving. She had shown them that strength wasn't always visible. It wasn't in the way someone looked or in the noise they made. It was in the calmness, the confidence, the quiet command that came from within. She had entered their world, not by force, but by her presence, and she had left, leaving them with a deep understanding of the power of silence and restraint. In the end, the lesson was clear. Never underestimate someone based on what they appear to be. The woman had walked in, seemingly unnoticed, but had reshaped everything around her. The guards, the analysts, the entire facility, they had all been part of her lesson. The world was not always as it seemed. Power, real power, often came from places least expected, and it didn't always announce itself. The woman's calm demeanor, her quiet strength, had done what no force could. It had commanded respect, had changed minds, and had shown the true nature of power. It was a lesson that would stay with them, a subtle reminder that beneath every surface, there may be more than meets the eye. As the last of her footsteps faded into the distance, the realization settled over everyone in the room. This wasn't just about her. It was about understanding, about humility, about the things we fail to see until they make themselves known in the most unexpected ways. The woman had left a lasting impression not through force, but through presence. And in that moment, everyone left standing behind her had learned something far more valuable than any training or technology could ever teach. The true lesson was that respect, humility, and strength came in many forms. Sometimes, the quietest presence held the most power.